Morning, everyone. I think all of you must have been affected, as certainly we were, by last Tuesday's events, in which this long months and months of struggle and campaigning finally ended, and there's a new president of the United States. It's not as if I speak here from a very political point of view. We seldom bring up political issues in the context of Ananda. We take more the position that we're all children of God, and personally I often say it's just not my world. The activism that we have is trying to change consciousness, not so much trying to change circumstances. But somehow this particular transition in the United States seems to have global implications, and those global implications have deeply personal spiritual implications as well. Partly it's because of the simple fact that Master Paramhansa Yogananda, back in 1948, 49, 50, the last years of his life, he spoke constantly, or frequently, according to Swami Kriyananda, of the fact that there would be great changes in the world and in the United States, particularly where he was speaking to those audiences. In fact, the words Swami used were that he thundered this announcement, and in fact he thundered it as a warning. And the phrase he used was, "You don't know what a terrible cataclysm is coming." Now that's almost 60 years ago now. And so you sort of, when you think of a terrible cataclysm, you think of it coming announced on Sunday and coming on Monday. So all these decades past have an inclination to make us think, oh well, maybe it's not so, maybe he wasn't quite right. Swami Kriyananda's answer to this, and I was talking about this a couple of weeks ago, was, well, you weren't there, you didn't hear him. If you had heard him speak, you would have taken it very seriously. And Swamiji does and has for all these years. Now, we haven't seen any real interruption of the life that we have. Now, of course, if you are the individual whose life has been disrupted, that's quite different. But collectively, we all still pretty much go about their business. Although David Gamow pointed out that when gas reached $4.50, Americans actually stopped driving less, which was the first time that had ever happened to Americans. Americans and their cars are just too intimate to ever be separated by something so small as the price of gasoline. But that was the first time that people actually stopped and thought, maybe things won't always be the same. And there was a tremendous amount of hope in some people's minds, or fear, depending, put on this election, because of, quite aside from politics, because of Barack Obama's race, because of his background. And it's been an amazing thing for me. One of my friends remarked that she was walking down the street right after the election, and she saw two black Americans coming toward her, two men. And she said they seemed to stand straighter and look her in the eye more than they ever had before. I find that deeply touching in my heart. Imagine, and I know I'm looking at some of your faces who have lived through this more than those of us who've just been on the observing side. Imagine always having the feeling in this country that you weren't quite accepted for who you are. And it's a great celebration for our whole country that we have overcome that deep-seated prejudice. Whether any of us still feel it personally or not, it's still been a kind of karmic blight on the country. And in fact, a few weeks ago when I was speaking here, I explained, and I'll repeat it, Master said one of the reasons that America is going to have to go through a period of greater suffering than we've ever gone through. I mean, all the wars that we've fought have been not on our soil. Certainly the Depression in the 30s was a very serious experience, but Master said even more is going to happen. And he said it's because of the karma of slavery and the subsequent treatment of black Americans, and because of the way we treated the American Indians. And that's like a karmic blight on the country that has to be expiated. But you can also see at the same time that dark forces are at work, also great positive forces are at work. And this is why many people inwardly, and rightly so, resist the thought that any great difficulty is coming, because there's so many ways you can point and see so many bright lights growing on the horizon everywhere you look. And I was thinking in this context, when in Medjugorje when there was an apparition of the Virgin Mary. I don't know if she's still appearing there or not. Is she still appearing there? Does anyone know? But anyway, for quite a few years, she was appearing on a regular basis to a group of 5 young people and children, or 6 or 7. And she was speaking a lot of the same things that Master had said, from the point of view of saying that the world has become so deeply materialistic and so atheistic that great changes are going to take place worldwide for the sake of bringing people back to God. That we can't just be so indifferent to divine truths. We can't continually break divine law and not have there be consequences. But Mother Mary said to those children, and through them to the world, you need to tell people, as she put it, to pray 3 hours every day. Interestingly, Swamiji's recommendation for our meditation is to try to meditate 3 hours every day. Not that everyone can fulfill that, but that gives us an ideal to strive for. And she says, in this way, the positive devotion generated by that worldwide movement will mitigate some of the negative energy that's been set in motion. The way that works is negative energy gets set in motion, and because of what Master called the thwarting cross currents of ego, which is if a person, I've used this as an example before, if a child is on a bicycle and he sees a smaller child next to him, and he's riding his bicycle and he decides to do something mean, and he swerves his bike a little bit and bumps into the smaller child and just keeps going. The smaller child falls over and can be enraged by it, but the bigger child has enough force that he just keeps going, and the little child can only shake his fist in impotent rage. But the force is set in motion, and that little child will grow up and perhaps not forget. And then later on, that karma, when things have balanced out, will come to it. So culturally, in the sort of bigger karma of a nation, which we all sign on for by being born into it, we set these negative forces in motion. And in the meantime, America does have this great good karma of prosperity and selflessness and generosity and egalitarianism, all these wonderful qualities. And that's been sort of the thwarting cross current of ego, so to speak, that has kept this karma at bay. And by the time the karma comes around, it really is like a meteor coming through the atmosphere. And depending on the vibration that's around us is how much of that meteor burns up in the atmosphere by the contrary energy, or how much that meteor can just meets itself, so to speak, meets its similar vibrations and just slides right through. So we have this karma that was based on greed and disregard for human welfare, and we've created a wonderful atmosphere of positive generosity and so on. It's held the karma at bay all this time, but it's still on a trajectory. And depending on what vibration we have collectively will help affect how deeply it comes. Now, the finest kind of vibrations we can put out, of course, are the vibrations of attunement to the divine spirit. And Master said, in fact, that's why all this is happening, is to make us more attuned, will happen, is to make us more attuned to the divine vibration. Now, I've been talking culturally, nationally, but of course you can see the same principles are also true. All of us choose a particular time and place to be born because there's going to be a karmic resonance with the experience that we have. We choose either to be born into or to move to a country because there's something right about the relationships. But not all group karma hits every individual in exactly the same way. And every individual has a different role to play in how that karma is going to play out. And this is where Mother Mary is saying that there's this worldwide reality going on, but the more energy goes out in divine harmony, the more it creates a harmonious atmosphere in which disharmonious forces will be to a certain extent burned up before they can strike. And if we're going to speak individually, of course, that is the simplest and the most obvious thing to do in any circumstance that we meet. And as I was saying, I find it interesting that nationally and internationally, I mean, the whole world has never rejoiced as the world has rejoiced at the election of this American president. And it's just fascinating from a sociological or from a political, however you want to look at it, that the individual man, and none of us know him, whether you like his politics or not, he makes a good impression as an individual. He's obviously thoughtful and intelligent, and he doesn't seem to be a person who has a kind of knee-jerk bully's reaction. And I think that's why the international world likes him. But it's been expressed many times, and I'm repeating non-scriptural sources here, that he represents a kind of return to a certain kind of idealism, not the least because of his race, because America was willing to overcome that negativity and elect someone that in other times we would never have considered. It represents a return to idealism. Now, the issue really is only partially national, from my point of view, because I'm not a politician, I'm a preacher. And I'm preaching for the good of our souls. But what we see here is a trajectory of energy. And we're all going to have, we all have, and I think we're going to have increasingly, assuming Master's predictions are correct, whether or not, the economy will unravel tomorrow, whether or not any of these conflagrations will expand immediately. The fact of the matter is, it's not exactly business as usual, for the present time. And so all of us are going to have very difficult choices to make. And the choice to make is fundamentally, when stress and difficulty comes to us, do we try to solve it by becoming more and more tense and hoping to make ourselves hard enough inside that we'll be able to resist it? Or do we take the opposite tact and realize that every challenge that comes to us is a challenge to see if we can expand our consciousness to embrace it without losing our joy. And truthfully, that's the only reason we're born at all. That's why we have been forced by our karmic realities to take a physical body. We have lessons to learn. And we can take these lessons in all kinds of complicated ways individually. We get very interested in all the details of our own karma. We love to find out about ourselves. Studying ourselves is just the most wonderful thing in the world. There was a wonderful moment in a Steve Martin movie that I just loved. Sometimes he just hits things so perfectly. And he was giving a little speech to his little team, and he was talking about how they're going to be really successful and all the signs of success. And he says, and then we will do this and we will do that. And by, of course, when I say we, I mean me. Just like that. And I laugh sometimes because it's just so, when I say we, of course I mean me, because we are fascinated by me. But even just thinking about ourselves as the hero or the heroine of this particular story, despite all the details, there's really only one question. The way Swamiji put it is, the energy either goes up the spine or it goes down. And we know from our actual experience that when energy goes up, that's the very definition, isn't it, of feeling uplifted. I feel so light today. I feel my spirits rise. Or we feel downcast. I feel so depressed. I feel so pulled down. Our very language is talking very esoterically. And the energy rises in the spine when experiences come to us and we perceive behind them the blessing hand of God. And of course, if things have come to us as the blessing hand of God, even if that blessing hand brings with it a great challenge, even if the comfort that we're used to, or the plans that we have made, or the protective role we've taken with the people that we love, if a challenge to all those well-established egoic ideas comes with that blessing hand, and yet we understand that this is what is going to be asked of us. This is the learning curve that we're on, is that we're going to have to be able to see, even in these circumstances, the joyful, loving hand of God. Or if we think, why me? Why is this happening to me? This is more than I can do. I can't handle this. Then the energy immediately goes down, doesn't it? Now, we have to understand that we are powerful beings on this planet. And it's not as if human ego controls the world. When Swamiji recorded a little speech for us at the fundraising dinner we had a couple of weeks ago, I think it was in that video, he made the simple phrase, yes, the world is falling apart, but don't be afraid, God will hold it together. Just like that. And that simple statement, that's the key. This is what our scriptural reading was talking about today. You know, knock, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be open to you. If you have enough faith, even the mountain will move. And then he tells that interesting story that's from the path about how Master used to be able to take those schoolboys across a dangerous place. And he said to them, do you believe in God? And all these little schoolboys would say yes. And then Master would take them across this dangerous trail. And never were they in any danger. But then he tells that interesting part about how another teacher tried that. And one of the little boys fell and died. I mean, such a strange story, isn't it? I've actually heard that story over and over, and I must confess, I always scratch my head at it. First, I think, it's just like, how horrible that one of the little boys died. And it also takes away from us what I would call a naive expectation that God expresses His grace by preventing suffering. You see, that's our wonderful concept of God, isn't it? That God is our little friend, and He just does what we want Him to do, isn't it? Swamiji described that kind of faith as like children, having little tea parties. And now we pour the tea, and now we serve the cookies, and, then we serve the teddy bear and the little lamb and all these things. And we have this little world, and it's so pretty like this. And really, without meaning to make too sharp a point on it, sometimes our faith in God is a little bit like that, isn't it? We just develop this little fantasy world and then we try to play it out. And then when hard life intrudes it upon ourselves, we're not prepared. That's really what's the difficulty of the fantasy kind of faith, is that we're not prepared. So Master in this story, and if you really visualize yourself there, you can feel the power of it. Master's a young man. He's going to this dangerous place with this group of little boys. Yes, he had a boys' school. It was little boys. If any of you have ever spent any time in a classroom of children, you recognize that, well, they don't always cooperate. They have minds of their own. But Master had this perception. It wasn't just this idea that, if we ask God, God will take care of us. Master's experience of that truth was based, of course, on lifetimes of dedicated effort, time after time after time, whatever God sent, to have the power of concentration, the courage, the impersonal attitude towards oneself, where you say, I know the hand of God is behind this, and I'm going to go forward with the faith that it is. By the time Master was Paramhansa Yogananda, and really long before that, he'd mastered every one of those conflicting cross-currents of ego, but he mastered them by the instructions he gives us, step by step, moment by moment. And the main way it's described is when those blows of fate come to us, do we cave in like this? Just crouching over a little, pulling our heart in a little bit more? Or do we pull our shoulders back and stand up that much more openly to life? Now, all lives bring us great challenge, and it may be, in fact, that our whole nation's going to bring us great challenge in the next years ahead. But there's Master standing on the edge of that cliff, and he's not affirming it. He's feeling that omnipresent power of God, and with that power, he takes those students across. He's not hoping for it. It has shifted, as our reading talks about, from the belief, which is a belief is enough to cause you to do the experiment. I believe that God will help me. I believe that meditation will benefit me. I believe that divine acceptance brings power. But then we have faith in it because we have practiced it again and again and again and again. And if we imagine that just practicing it when it's easy and it occurs to us is going to enable us to safely cross a dangerous precipice and take a group of small children with us, it's possible if we practice when it's easier. And practice when it's difficult, and practice all the time. We can wait until our situation is dire. or we can practice all the time. In the Festival of Light every week, we repeat that Festival of Light every week because the truths in there are so fundamental. And some of you, like us, reading it every week, you can practically recite it with us mentally, if not actually. You can really hear those phrases, but you move through life and different one of those phrases just pop out. There's this one. Whereas in the past, the coin of man's redemption was suffering and sorrow. Now that has been exchanged for calm acceptance and joy. We have this very strong thought in our mind that when difficult things happen, we feel obligated to suffer. We feel obligated to sort of live in our thwarted ego desires. So my ego desires have been thwarted, therefore I must be upset. We sometimes even think we're not being healthy if we're not upset. I'm not talking about falseness. I'm not talking about tea parties where you're just making it up and it's not really there. I'm talking about just looking right at the circumstances of life and choosing another alternative, calm acceptance and joy. The way that difficulties reach us at all is when there's a similar vibration. The more fear there is, the more even small difficulties are magnified. There is no reason in the divine law for us to suffer. There's another place. Self-love is the cause of suffering, we say. The fruit of self-love is suffering. The fruit of love for God is joy. Now think about that. The fruit of loving God is joy. That means whatever circumstances come to us, if we just say, oh well, here's another joyous adventure. Life is a giant sort of walk in the wilderness, after all. We have to just overcome this thought that the purpose of life is to be comfortable and to have our desires fulfilled. That is the American delusion. And we backed it with this tremendous creative energy. So a great many of our desires can be fulfilled and we're very, very comfortable. I was standing in the shower this morning and the hot water was just pouring over my head and I was long since all soaped up and washed off and I'm just standing here, just letting the hot water run over my head and pour down the drain and thinking to myself, I wonder how long I'll be able to keep doing this. I don't just mean this morning, but I mean just for the rest of my life. I love just standing here, being comfortable in this hot water. That's what the ego tells us in all kinds of ways. I have my little family, I have my little money, I have my little house. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But what we always have is the opportunity to experience God through it. Now, a lot of times that's just a belief. And then when the suffering gets too intense, we can't remember anymore. And I don't mean suffering like being tortured somewhere. The suffering can be so intense just because somebody was really mean to you. And all of a sudden our whole world falls apart. Or we do something unspeakably stupid, which occasionally happens. And there we are just humiliated and ashamed and embarrassed before God. Every time there's a tendency for the heart to shrink, just pull your shoulders back, lift your heart up, stand before God and say to Divine Mother, you're not going to get rid of me so easily. It's a very important attitude to have. One of the dearest parts of the path, Swamiji writes about one of Master's disciples who had what Swami called, I think that man had commotion karma. Maybe I'm mixing people up, but it was a different man. But he was a very difficult disciple. He had the good karma to be a direct disciple of Master, and yet he was riddled with bad karma, bad inclinations, bad habits, bad ways of behavior. He wasn't a good disciple in any way you looked at it, except he was devoted to Master. And Master described him as a mouthful of hot molasses. He says, too hot to swallow, but too sticky to spit out. That's the attitude we should have in our relationship to God. Even if you have to say, and sometimes you can say it proudly, I may be your worst disciple. I may be the most terrible devotee you've ever seen, but I am tenacious. I think sometimes of Master walking, the Guru walking, or Divine Mother, however you see it, and you sort of see the ankle go by, and you grab the ankle like that. Like little children just holding on to an ankle. Yesterday, Swami Kriyananda's visiting. David will speak of that in a moment, and we stopped by East West, and there was an relatively speaking, elderly Indian man who was there with his son-in-law. And the Indian man, the older man, lives in India, so he's seen Swami Kriyananda's face on the television. So he looks around, and all of a sudden he sees this man he knows. Swami was tired, so he sat down. So this man comes over and speaks to him, and then his son-in-law comes right in east-west. The man does a full prostration, and just puts his hands on Swami's feet. I mean, in India that would be an understood thing, but he didn't even hesitate, just right there in east-west like that. I love that pose. It's not a question of people lying down in east-west. It's the pose I like is lying at the feet of the master and grabbing his ankles like that. Inwardly, that's what we have to do. Just because the masters, they like that. What they want from us is to have the same belief in ourselves and the same understanding of their power to transmit the divine to us that they themselves have. You see, Master knew that this disciple was a difficult disciple, but he also knew that that disciple had committed himself to Master, and therefore Master had to save him. You understand how powerful that is? It's something that you should meditate on every minute of every day. God will never desert you. He won't necessarily cooperate with your ideas, but he will never desert you. And that the stronger your grip is, doesn't matter what you're doing with your left hand, hold on with your right. Right? And whatever comes then, we go through it together. And however much we suffer or don't suffer, whereas in the past, suffering and sorrow were how we escaped. Now it's just calm acceptance and the joy. What difference does it make? What happens to us? God is always with us.